The city, the crowds, the constant hurry and work. This is what city living is like for most Americans today.
The one thing about people who live in towns and cities is they don't make their own food. That's so obvious we tend to forget about it. And the vast majority of Americans live in an urban place now, and that trend began really as soon as the American Revolution ended. Because so many people were moving to towns and cities, they needed farmers to produce food for them, including meat. That in turn shaped the system of raising livestock and producing meat. Everything flowed from that. The people who came here as colonists came from a world of scarcity. If there was a culture shock that these people experienced, it was that they realized that for all intents and purposes, as near as they could tell, there was no end to the land. And that allowed them to do the one thing that they regarded as the mark of a civilized people. It allowed them to establish livestock husbandry and raise domesticated livestock. By the time the Revolution ended, Americans simply regarded it as their absolute right. We are entitled to meat whenever we want it. Americans systematically kept pushing cattle production further and further west because as more cities grew, demand for land took land away from pasture and grazing. So you had to keep moving, cattle kept moving further west. And a fairly large system of stockyards emerged in Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City, with Chicago being the largest. A place where shippers, drovers, commission agents would bring in thousands and thousands of head of cattle and hogs so that they could be bought and sold, and then shippers would send the stock to these urban cities. Butchers and slaughterhouse operators would then buy the livestock, parade them through the street, and take them to their shop. By the 1870s, Americans who lived in cities were sick to death of having to deal with this constant parade of animals through their streets. And they also became, frankly, and who could blame them, sick of having the stench and the muck and the constant blood flow through the streets from these slaughterhouses scattered all over. So in the 1880s, there was a great move on the part of city leaders and urban voters, as well as these packing entrepreneurs, to consolidate and centralize the system to try to move as much of the unpleasantness out of sight and out of mind. They decided to leave the slaughter in the West and only ship the carcasses, and that completely transformed the meat packing system. So this infrastructure emerged, very sophisticated and very efficient, for one purpose, and that was to feed people living in cities so that they could get the meat to which they felt entitled. From about 1890 to about 1930 or so, food prices in this country soared to a level we would never tolerate today. Urban consumers were extraordinarily demanding. They wanted cheap food, and it turns out that prolonged period of high prices drove consumer frustration and caused riots, for example, caused meat boycotts. We're not going to eat any meat until you lower the price. But the simple cause was the big gap between supply and demand. Farmers simply could not keep up with this urban demand. Consumers were getting sort of cheap food, sort of, but not exactly, and farmers were going broke right and left. And urban consumers and politicians and the USDA and even farmers said, we really must make a new model of agriculture because the one we have is not serving an urban nation. And farmers embraced things like confinement, the use of antibiotics, mechanized feeding operations, mechanized watering operations, but all of it was driven by the need to ensure that farmers could earn a profit and consumers could enjoy low-cost food. Ultimately, we can trace everything to what consumers wanted, and someone was going to figure out how to do it. I think that given the demand we have for meat, not just in the United States, but we have a big demand for meat in the United States. Given that, and given how much of the rest of the world relies on Americans to make meat for them, I think we actually have a close to perfect system for doing that. I say close to perfect because, yeah, it would be just dandy if we could figure out some way to raise a lot of cattle without generating a lot of manure, but I don't know how you're going to do that. If somehow concentrated feeding operations are banned, well, I think everyone's going to get a big wake-up call about the reality of what it would take to make this much beef without using these very efficient systems. It affects the least amount of land, air, and water. It affects the least amount of people negatively, and it benefits the most people by providing millions and billions of people with low-cost meat.